Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the life and the wildly influential ideas of a thinker who entirely upended the mid-20th century economic status quo. We're talking, of course, about Milton Friedman. He was a professor whose theories championed free markets and literally altered the course of global history, shifting the world away from centralized, command-and-control economic systems. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to trace his journey across 5 parts: an economic revolutionary, the Keynesian clash, real-world policy impacts, global reach and controversy, and finally, mainstreaming the free market. Let's get right into it.
Starting off with Section 1, in Economic Revolutionary.
Picture this. Born in Brooklyn to poor immigrant parents, Friedman eventually found his true intellectual home at the University of Chicago, and that is where he pioneered something called monetarism. Now, at the time, the entire establishment believed the Great Depression was caused by the inherent failure of free market capitalism. But Friedman, he totally flipped the script. He argued that the real culprit was actually a massive failure of government monetary policy. Specifically, he pointed the finger at the Federal Reserve for failing to provide liquidity during a really critical bank crash back in 1930. A huge, landmark year for his theories was 1957. That's when he published his highly technical work on the permanent income hypothesis. Basically, he proved that people don't just make spending decisions based on some short-term cash infusion they get today. Instead, they spend based on what they expect their long-term, permanent earnings to be over time. It was a real game changer for how we understand consumer behavior. Which brings us to Section 2, the Keynesian clash. You have to understand the epic battle lines of the mid-20th century. On the left, you had the globally accepted Keynesian paradigm. They argue that free markets simply couldn't manage themselves. They believed you needed central controls, massive government intervention, and strict wage and price controls. But on the right, you had Friedman and the Chicago School pushing hard for the exact opposite: totally free markets, shrinking the size of the government, and aggressive deregulation. It was a massive clash of worldviews.
But here's the thing, for a really long time, Friedman was entirely dismissed by the establishment. Take John Kenneth Galbraith, for example. He was an immensely popular economist and presidential advisor at the time, and he viewed Friedman as this outdated oddball. Galbraith basically said Friedman's ideas were fine for the 18th century, but entirely irrelevant to the modern 20th century. So Friedman and his colleagues were really a beleaguered minority. Most people thought they were completely out of touch.
So you really gotta wonder, how exactly did these deeply unpopular minority ideas survive all that academic ridicule in the 1950s to eventually rewrite global public policy? Let's dig into that in Section 3, Real-World Policy Impacts.
Friedman had actually long argued against the military draft. And during the Vietnam War, he served on a commission appointed by President Nixon to look into creating an all-volunteer force. There was this incredible exchange with General Westmoreland, who argued that a volunteer force was basically a mercenary force. He said he wouldn't want to command mercenaries and accused Friedman of calling drafted soldiers slaves. Well, Friedman shot right back. He said he didn't like patriotic volunteers being called mercenaries, and he logically dismantled the military stance piece by piece.
Talk about a staggering trajectory of influence. Look at this timeline. In 1964, Friedman advised Barry Goldwater, who went on to suffer a crushing political defeat. But fast forward to 1971, and the ideas Friedman championed actually took root when the U.S. completely eliminated the military draft. Then, by 1980, there he is hosting a wildly popular PBS broadcast, literally pushing his policy ideas into millions of living rooms across the country. Another major real-world impact was in education. Friedman believed that if you directed tax money to a school of a parent's choice, whether public or private, it would completely invigorate the entire system. And we saw this play out in Milwaukee's school choice program. Private voucher schools showed significant improvements in math and reading, and they did it at roughly half the cost. Meanwhile, the public schools, suddenly facing this new threat of competition, actually saw their achievement scores improve too. For his supporters, this was the ultimate proof of his core assumption. Competition forces all systems to satisfy their customers. Moving beyond the U.S., let's look at Section 4, Global Reach and Controversy. Let's start with Estonia. Right after the fall of the Soviet Union, Estonia's 32-year-old prime minister, Mart Laar, desperately needed a new direction. Amazingly, he had only ever read one economics book, and it was Friedman's. Inspired, he implemented exactly what Friedman proposed. They rolled out a 24% flat personal income tax with 0 loopholes, 0 corporate tax on reinvested profits, and they went all in on tech and free public internet. In no time, Estonia transformed from an economic backwater into a booming, highly competitive, low-tax laboratory. Now, over in Latin America, the adoption of his ideas occurred under vastly different, heavily authoritarian circumstances. Under Salvador Allende's socialist government in Chile, inflation had hit a devastating 1,000%. After a military coup in 1973, led by General Augusto Pinochet, the economy was still totally cratering. Eventually, the regime turned to the Chicago Boys. These were Chilean economists who had actually trained at the University of Chicago. They proposed a radical free market shock treatment. This included an unprecedented privatized pension system that ended up drastically raising national savings. During this incredibly volatile period, Friedman himself visited Chile and briefly met with General Pinochet for about 45 minutes. And Friedman made his stance very clear during this meeting. He explicitly warned the dictator that economic and political liberty simply must coexist. He told him straight up, you cannot have a free economy without political freedom. But despite that warning, the mere fact that he advised the regime at all sparked an absolute firestorm globally. When Friedman traveled to Stockholm in 1976 to accept his Nobel Prize, he was met by thousands of angry protesters. It was so intense that he required 24-hour police protection and even had to sneak into the ceremony through a back door. It really just goes to show how fiercely polarizing the intersection of his economic theories and global politics had become. Yet, despite all the controversy, the long-term reality of the free trade structures he advocated really did take root. Just look at Chile's modern export success today, using the Montes winery as a prime example. They export a whopping 92% of their award-winning wine to 69 different countries. The U.S. takes the largest slice, followed by the U.K. and Asia, while the local market is just a tiny sliver. It's a perfect, concrete example of an economy that is wholly integrated into and thriving upon global free trade. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, mainstreaming the free market. By the time the 1980s rolled around, the whole political vibe had shifted dramatically. Friedman joined President Ronald Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board. Reagan shared Friedman's deep suspicion of government overreach. He actually captured this perfectly using an ancient quote from Lao Tzu, "Govern a great nation as you would cook a small fish. Do not overdo it." With Friedman in his ear, the Reagan administration aggressively cut taxes, deregulated industries, and really reined in government interference. And this wasn't just an American phenomenon. It went completely global. The late 20th century saw massive, sweeping shifts away from command and control economies. From Eastern Europe breaking away from Soviet communism to massive market reforms in India and China, these policies literally lifted hundreds of millions of people out of severe poverty. Even his really technical academic concepts, like the natural rate of unemployment, went from being fringe ideas to just accepted conventional wisdom all over the world. But here is a crucial caveat that Friedman constantly hammered home. He was a stickler for precise language, and he always reminded people that true capitalism is not just a profit system. No, it's a profit and loss system. A functioning market has to ruthlessly punish bad decisions and inefficiencies just as much as it rewards the good ones. Without that actual risk of loss, the whole system falls apart. At the end of the day, a massive part of his influence, beyond just the raw economic theory, was his unbelievable ability to teach. He made incredibly complex ideas totally accessible to the average person. His unscripted PBS series, Free to Choose, was a huge hit, and the book that went with it sold well over 1 million copies in 16 different languages. He just had this rare gift where he could speak to a high school student or a U.S. president with the exact same clarity and respect. So we'll leave you with this final, incredibly provocative thought from Friedman. He strongly argued that a society that puts equality before freedom will ultimately end up with neither, but a society that puts freedom before equality will end up with a great measure of both. It is a powerful question, isn't it? One that really challenges us to think about that delicate balance between liberty and equity in the world today. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.